Hello and welcome to Household Filmmaking, and I am visiting at his home my friend writer James Hudnall, who also has his own YouTube channel, which is what is it called? James Hudnall.
Yeah, just James Hudnall.
James Hudnall, and he is also one of the story creators for the Ultraverse universe for Malibu Comics in the '90s. Esper's, Blue Cat, and I'm forgetting one. There's another.
Age of Heroes,
Age of
The
Heroes,
Psycho,
Lex Luthor.
Harsh Realm.
So James has written a lot of comic books over the years, and he also has done some screenwriting, and his channel has all sorts of information for aspiring writers. And he and we've just come back from lunch, and we've just been having all sorts of conversations about writing. So I just figured we'd just pick it up. But I think we were talking over lunch about your Indiegogo, which is funded. That was Agenda, and you have another comic project. I don't know if you're ready to talk about that yet or not, but
I have a bunch of ones, but yeah, right now that's what I'm focusing on.
So Agenda funded. You're creating that. You're working on getting the rewards out soon, and you're kind of have like a whole new crop of stuff that you're working on at the moment, right?
Yes.
So, what's the state of writing right now for you? Are you kind of, is it all balanced between your YouTube channel and your comics, because they all kind of play into each other?
Yeah, my YouTube channel I started getting serious about last month in December 2018. I've had it since 2006, but I haven't really used it that much. But now I'm doing regular videos on writing process, and also will be doing on other aspects of creativity. I'll also be doing other content. I'm also interviewing other creative people that I know. So I'm doing that, and I plan on expanding that to make hopefully daily videos. But right now I do at least 3 or 4 a week. And then the writing is something that I'm doing as far as comics. Right now I'm doing a lot of comics. I'm writing a screenplay, and I'm trying to formulate my next novel to get it more closer to being done. I've been working on it for years, but now I'm putting more focus on structuring it out better. So, and then in addition to that, I also work, but in between projects at the moment, when I say work, I'm a web developer. I'm an internet engineer, as we call them. So, not so much I'm a web programmer more than a web developer, but anyway.
Well, we've all had to carry our day jobs. Plus, and we're not really ready to talk about this, but you're writing a screenplay for a movie project that is from a producer that I'm working with and myself. So that's, but we're not ready to talk about that. But I am excited about that. So I just thought I would mention that, so when it becomes a huge hit, you heard it here first. But yeah, so we were talking about, I don't know, one of the things that was really kind of interesting me we were talking about was you and I both get people kind of messaging us and stuff and saying, I've got great ideas, why don't you work on them with me? I have a problem with that. Not, I'm flattered that they want to work with me, and I don't begrudge them for being excited enough to have their own projects, but it's really the wrong approach. So sorry for anyone listening to this who's approached me in this way. I'm not trying to bash you, but it's we were discussing about how that's an awkward situation for us because we've got our own projects and ideas. That's not, people always say I've got a great idea, but that's not the point.
Yeah, ideas are not created equally. However, they're not as rare as people think. A lot of people get ideas, and not all ideas are as good as you think they are sometimes. When you have to really think your ideas through. A lot of people don't do that. They just have an idea, but they haven't really thought it through and the implications of the idea. So the quality of an idea is more on the way it can be played out and with the potential for affecting other things. It's not just, I have an idea about somebody with a superpower. I mean, there's like a million of those. So, what is so specifically interesting and different about your idea that makes it something that people would be interested in? That's something that people need to consider. So, I would say that that is a fundamental thing that people need to understand, is that ideas themselves aren't all there is to it.
When you're asking a writer too to work with you on your idea, it's kind of to a writer, especially someone who's busy and has a lot of experience, you're essentially asking them to, like, here, I have this heavy load and you get to lift it.
Yeah, basically, a lot of people want. They know they can't do it themselves because they don't have the skills. So they want somebody with the skills to execute their idea, and then they can take credit for it. But it doesn't work like that. Basically, the people are going to have to understand that if you want somebody to put a lot of sweat equity into something, they need to get something back in return. Expecting somebody to make you rich is not how things work in reality. And a lot of people think I have this pipe dream, and if somebody just executes the pipe dream for me, it's going to make me rich. I mean, it's the old joke about, here's a list of things to do to become a millionaire. First, you want to be a millionaire, and then the middle part is do something, and then part 3 is be a millionaire. That's not how it works in reality. The hard work, somebody has to do the hard work, and if you're expecting other people to do it for you, you got to understand that there's going to be things that are going to come with that you may not have foreseen, which in itself is an idea. But I mean, don't expect things to just magically happen for you by using somebody else's labor, because somebody is going to want to be a part of that, or they're going to be attached to it in some way. And if it's a success, I guarantee you it's going to follow you the rest of your life. That person is going to be attached to you in some way. You have to consider that.
Well, I find that what makes an idea good, like you said, is the execution. And I think a lot of the execution comes from the idea coming from somebody who came up with that idea because they had something to say originally. And that resonates in the process of creating it, and that's really what the audience gets from it, because I'm a pretty structured, pretty mundane writer in terms of my process, but where I get excited is where I get to imbue the story with the themes and values that I find exciting and important, and that's when I think the story really starts to resonate. But otherwise, if I were to hand it off to someone else, I would do it because I feel that person has something that resonates with me and I would like to see imbued in that story. But if you're just seeing like, oh, this person's good at this, maybe they can do the work for me, again, you're gonna, I don't know, I think that person will end up being the star. You won't, because people will eventually figure out who did that heavy lifting and who really imbued it with that.
Yeah, absolutely. The person who has the creative juice to make something happen, whether you like it or not, they're going to get the attention. However, you might get famous off of there's like famous people I won't name necessarily, but who became hugely successful off the sweat of other people's brows, and they got a lot of the credit. But that stuff is less likely to happen in this day and age than it would have happened in, say, the 50s or the 60s. So it's harder for somebody to take all the credit for somebody else's work than it used to be. So it's not a good process to think that you can do that. You have to be partnered with somebody. You can't just expect them to do everything and then you just give them a little share or a little check, and then that's the last you're going to see of them. That's not how it works. There's a lot of people that I know, they started off, in the 60s or the 70s. They created a bunch of characters which ended up being comic book movie characters, and they didn't really get hardly anything in return for that. It was called the work for hire system. And if you work for like a major publisher for a licensed character, even if it's a character you created, if the company owns that character, you might get credit as being the creator of that character, but you don't necessarily get the benefits of that unless you work out a really good deal. So if you're somebody, let's say, who has an idea that you want to become like this, the next big thing, you have to realize that there's a large machine in place that makes those things happen. Characters that become big, like the Avengers or something, it took them decades to get there. They had a machine of a comic book company and then a large film company, Disney, one of the biggest in the world, which owns Marvel now. You they had the machinery in place. They had the years of experience of marketing properties and everything, so they could make it happen. Just you alone, unless you have like an expertise in these areas of marketing and promotion and publicity, don't expect things to happen overnight or huge success. It happens in stages, happens over time, and the next big thing might take decades to occur. So it might take 30, 40 years before you see it. Don't necessarily think it's going to happen overnight. No overnight sensation thing doesn't happen very often. And if you think I'm going to be the exception, that's a foolish thing to think. Most people think that, and it doesn't happen for most people.
Well, there's that saying I've heard people say, like, I was an overnight sensation. It took me 20 years to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's an old Andy Rooney, the guy who used to be on 60 Minutes. A lot of people may not even know who that is, but he was like this old man on 60 Minutes, used to do commentary. And he said that I spent 30 years of my life trying to be a famous writer, and I spent the last years of my life trying to avoid people who recognize me.
Well, I think the other thing that people don't realize is that it's, like in terms of Marvel too, it's like, I mean, I definitely saw this in a movie trailer. It was put up on an indie site, and it was a guy, he'd shot the movie, and obviously had a lot of money in it, but it was kind of like a, part of the trailer made it look like it was a drug cartel, special unit movie. And then another part of it made it look like it was almost a Marvel movie without the superheroes, with like the witty one lines you almost expected, like the Guardians of the Galaxy pop music to start up with it or something like that. And I thought, this is someone who has created something that they're trying to chase after, the success of movies that have more money, more celebrities, more everything than and that took years to build up. Like even the Marvel movies as we know them now took 10 years to get to this point, to this like honed, and they are formulaic. I think they're very entertaining for the most part. I think they're successful.
But they had a lot of false starts. They had a lot of low budget versions that happened years before that.
Oh yeah, I remember the Captain America movie where Captain America had like a motorcycle helmet with a star on it, and there was Dolph Lundgren as the Punisher.
Right.
And but again, their accomplishment is, for better or worse, is their accomplishment. If you try and repeat that. And I think when you interviewed me on your show, I said that it was a realization I had too. For the longest time, I wanted to do comics just like Eddie Campbell. And then I had this realization, like, that's idiotic. Even if I could do comics like Eddie did, people still wouldn't be interested in them because they could just go to Eddie. They don't need a bargain basement Eddie Campbell wannabe. And nobody wants a Marvel Comics wannabe because they can sniff it right away too. They can, this guy's watched too many Marvel movies and he's trying to do that shtick. And I can just go to Marvel. They've got better writers, better funding, and as a result too, this trailer had no personality of its own, had no vision of its own, and it was like a hodgepodge of all these different things you could tell this filmmaker liked and wanted to emulate. And as a result, it ended up being none of them. and not having anything of its own to call on. So
Yeah, it's something that's always bugged me, and I've seen it. Other people do this, and that is they come up with they so-called create something, and all it is a hodgepodge of stuff that they like that they've stolen from something else. Now, here's a fact about creativity: for thousands of years, people copy each other. It's a human nature, a human instinct to copy other people's stuff and do their version. But it's the people that add enough of their own personality and their own ideas and their own character into something. What is called the voice, the artistic voice. It's the essence of that person that makes it unique. And if you don't have anything to offer of yourself and you're just copying other people's ideas, then it's just nothing. It's just an empty knockoff. It's just like when you go to like a dollar store and you see all these knockoff toys which are ripped off from other things. That's essentially what you're creating when you just rip off other people's scenes from other movies and etc. It's just not an original thought, and it's boring because people have seen it before. They're not gonna care if they see it again.
that's funny because some of the there is a fine line too between copying because you think it's cool and doing an homage. I've seen some homages that they were so subtle I didn't notice them. I think those are the best ones until somebody made the comparison and I went, oh, that's what they were doing. But it wasn't like, look at this. You're like, remember this? Remember that it's kind of like what do they call it on South Park? The nostalgia berries. Where they're just throwing like, you remember this? You remember this from this?
Member berries.
Member berries. But we were talking about the new Star Wars movies as well. Essentially, it was a rehash with a bunch of nostalgia callbacks, but there was no these new characters were not developed. They didn't have any. There was the only vision they seemed to have, especially for these new Star Wars, and please forgive me, new Disney Star Wars fans, but it seems like they seem to be like, okay, we're gonna call back. But at the same time, we're going to tear down the old stuff, and we're going to replace it with something new and better.
Yeah.
Because we think we're new and better, but they really aren't new and better.
Well, in the Last Jedi movie, the writer Drew, what's his name is I'm blanking on his name all of a sudden. The guy who did that, he put the line in there to kill it and
kill the past.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like you're just saying, everything, the old stuff, we're just gonna replace it with our stuff, except our stuff is just a poor imitation of the old stuff, which was quote unquote original. It wasn't original. Star Wars was derivative of a lot of other things, like John Carter of Mars and Marvel Comics and a lot of things that he just sort of took from all these places, but at least he did it in such a way that it had its own kind of feel and look and everything. Whereas the stuff now, they're just taking all the design work and everything from the previous stuff and just putting new faces in it, but they haven't developed or fleshed out those characters at all. There's nothing beyond that. Just, like Rey there's not much to her character at all. I mean, she's just a mystery. We don't know anything, but yet she's able to do everything that it took Luke Skywalker a long time to figure out, and that's just it's kind of insulting to people who like these stuff. They like to see characters work at it to get to where they are, not to just suddenly automatically have things handed to them out of the blue.
Well, you see like Mark Hamill in a bunch of interviews, you could tell he's not happy. He was just already under contract and he had to but there's like interview after interview where he's going, this is not what Luke would do, this is not anything, but I guess it's for a new generation, and I had to fulfill my contract.
Yeah, he's trying to say something without saying it because he can't really, for legal reasons, he can't say certain things. So he's tried to dance around it, but obviously people can tell they're not happy with it. Now, from what I understand, they want to retcon The Last Jedi, and the J.J. Abrams' latest movie is going to reboot the reboot, or something. We'll see.
It's a mess. Well, I mean, the thing about it, and I think this is really what it's missing, is the movies themselves, and I know a lot of people aren't fans of the prequels. I enjoyed them.
Actually, a lot of people now are starting to appreciate those movies. After seeing these movies, they're sort of like, you know what, they weren't so bad.
Well, I'll tell you, the prequels, there's several things that I liked about them. One, they weren't afraid to go with an emotional aspect. The most recent movies are just emotionless.
Yeah.
He did try something new and different. It worked for some people, not for others. He did go with the kind of Flash Gordon style of acting and presentation, which even back then was kind of hokey and wooden. Anyway, I don't want to go too much in that direction, but the prequels and the original series, they were all in service of certain values that the characters had. And those values always influenced the decisions of the characters and made sense in the logic of that universe. In Disney Star Wars, like I said, again, Rey has whatever situation comes up, Rey has the skill for it. Whatever they need the Force to be, the Force is, where before there were rules to the Force.
Well, here's the question for Rey. Like, what is her operating philosophy? What does she want exactly? She just wants to know who her parents are, yet she doesn't want to leave the planet that she was living on, Naboo. She doesn't want to leave her nest, but at the same time, she wants to know who they are, but she really doesn't want to go out and find out where they are because she thinks they'll be coming back to Naboo anytime now, even though they haven't in 20-something years. It's just like there's just like a lot of logic behind that character, and that's that character's real motivation. What is the real motivation of Finn? What is the real all these other characters? Blanking on his name, but the guy, the fighter guy, is like
Poe?
Poe, yeah. His only motivation is he's fighting for the Resistance, but we don't know anything about him except that he's a pilot, and he wears a jacket, and other than that, and his personality. But we don't really know anything about his life or what he interests are. I mean, we didn't know anything about Luke Skywalker's life as far as what kind of rock band he listened to or whatever, but. There was a sense of the person there.
Well, it unfolded too. At every moment he was on screen, you knew something about him.
I just don't feel like there's a lot of character development in these stories so far. But just to get away from that for a minute, I was just thinking about. We were talking earlier about not on this tape, but at lunch we were talking about Tarantino's movies, Quentin Tarantino's. And I was just going to make a point about copying. Is Tarantino in the
Hateful Eight?
No.
Django?
No. The one before that, the World War II movie.
Inglourious Basterds.
Inglourious Basterds, right? I was blanking on the first part of the thing. Inglourious Basterds. It opens with a scene which is totally taken from The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, but what he did is he moved it to France in World War II, and it was about a farmer and basically a Nazi guy. So Lee Van Cleef's character in the Western version shows up at this farm because he wants to get information from this guy who might be hiding some information about somebody that Lee Van Cleef is supposed to kill. In this movie, a Nazi commander shows up, wants to get information on these Jews that he wants to kill. The setup and the execution and everything is pretty much the same, but there's differences so that unless you're a student of these two films, you would understand what the similarities are and but at least he made it his own thing. But he goes so far as to use Ennio Morricone music, although not from Good, Bad, and the Ugly, but it's from a different piece, but he's using that as the music, almost like a cue to cue it back to the old movie. So that's an homage, because an homage will take from something, but it will also add something to it that will make it its own thing. So even though it's obviously swiping something, it's also adding some nuances and some textures to it so that it's not just a rehash of something that's already been done, but not as good. and not as interesting or as talented an execution. I mean, I think Tarantino executed that scene very well, and he added some things to it to make it different and unique. So, whereas in the Star Wars movies, the current ones, they're sort of just rehashing things, but instead of having a Death Star, they have a Death Planet. Instead of something the size of a moon, it's now the size of a planet. That's just, that's not, just ramping things up isn't making it better.
Well, the other thing too, you mentioned Quentin Tarantino. But I personally have never been a fan of his films, but people who are a fan of Quentin Tarantino, I think they'll show up for his movies because the name, they know what they're going to get. And even if Quentin Tarantino he said he had a Star Trek script. No matter what he does, his fans are going to show up because they like his brand, his way of doing things. They're entertained by it. And I think Quentin Tarantino is successful in that his personality shines through in his art, always. So, he can do Star Trek, he can do an homage to something, but he will always do it in such a way that he infuses his artistic spirit into it and makes it his own. And I will never disrespect that. I personally, like I said, I'm not a fan of Quentin Tarantino, but it's only because what he finds interesting story-wise is, or dialogue-wise, is generally what turns me off of a story. But it's not because it's bad. He does what he does very well. And I would never take that away from him or anybody who's a fan of his work. I wouldn't say, oh, he's terrible. Why do you like that crap? Because I don't see it in that way. It's just not what attracts me to a story. And that's another thing, too. I think that a lot of storytellers have to understand in creating a story, you can do everything right. Don't expect everybody to like it. It may be that you're missing the mark not on a technical level. You can structure things and get the characters right and that sort of thing. But, it's like my wife had that 70s show on the other day. I watched the episode and I went, yeah, this is a good show. But if I see it on the menu, I never click on it. And I said that to my wife. She said, well, if it's a good show, then why don't you like watching it? I said, it just doesn't appeal to me. And so there's also kind of as a storyteller, you have to either know your audience and know what appeals to them if that's the audience you want to write to, or adversely, you have to also be willing to say, okay, I'm trying to write to this audience, but they're not taking it. And then examine what it is you're doing wrong that for some reason you're not hitting that mark, which again, I think is, the people in charge of the Star Wars movies, because we keep coming back to that, have been, like, Tarantino has his audience, and he knows how to hit that mark every time. He just has to be himself. The people handling the Star Wars movies, they've been completely tone deaf to their audience, and when their audience tries to go to them and say, this is what you're getting wrong, their answer is pretty much a big middle finger to their audience, which is like, you're doubling down on losing these people. And as much money as Disney has invested in obtaining Star Wars and building their Star Wars land, I have no idea what must be going through their mind to make them think that they should stay the course on their attitude and the way they're going about things, because they stand to lose a lot of money. If you turn people off of Star Wars enough, they're not even going to want to come hang out in Star Wars land and take photos and buy merchandise.
Yeah, that's the thing that Disney has done, is a lot of people are really super offended by the revisionist movies that, well, I don't know if they're revisionist, but they don't like what they're doing. They're not liking where it's going. And then they go so far as to call anybody who doesn't like what they're doing toxic fans. Like, they don't have a right to complain if they're doing something that the fans don't like. They have every right to complain if they don't like what Disney is doing.
The fans know why they like this stuff. They know what it is that Lucas did that made them, buy the lightsabers and cosplay and that sort of thing. And they're that they're offering Disney, that information, and to slap those fans' hands and say, well, this is for a new generation. Well, I have two kids, 12 and 7, and they don't give a crap about Star Wars either way, new or old. So I don't think the new generation, if you're gonna foster those fans, now's the time to do it. Banking on, and this is something as well. I had this conversation with a friend of mine, the composer of my movie, The Quantum Terror. He's always said, well, Disney's thing is, kind of, it's like Disney grooming gangs. They're grooming the kids to like stuff now so that when they're adults, they can bring it back and sell it to them again. Mm-hmm. Well, if you screw that up, if you spend all this time investing in something that they, and I know at this point we're talking more merchandising and we're talking about kind of almost predatory marketing, but yeah, if you don't have something to begin with that they can't look back on, and like I said, my kids just were just at the movie theater watching Mary Poppins Returns. Well, I know for a fact that my wife loved the original Mary Poppins, and she wanted to see it probably more than the kids did, because she's hoping that there's something in there that will kind of give her a little more of what she got from the original. But if you're taking your kids to see the new Star Wars movies and they're going, these suck, then they're not going to come back, 30 years later and go, remember when we hated the Star Wars? Let's go see it again. So I don't know. It's weird. But again, as a writer, even if you're writing something completely new, you have to keep in mind you could be doing everything right, but you could still be missing the mark. There's that kind of ingredient. And I think when it comes to new material, creating new characters, creating new properties, universe building, which is a big buzzword now, which I think is kind of something people should kind of like work on your characters before you spend too much time on your universe. Let the universe unfold through the story, rather than thinking about that. But that all has to kind of come from an internal place, something that means something to you. And I'm sure with Lucas, you mentioned John Carter, Princess of Mars, which is one of my favorite book series. And I want to emulate. Like, Lucas emulated it in a way that he took from it the things that appealed to him and he wanted to perpetuate. And he rebranded it with his own vision of what his universe and those kind of adventures would be. And then with James Cameron, he did it with Avatar. And it kind of fell flat. It was not... for me, it was a little too derivative, and the universe he built around it, it was just blue and green the whole time.
And also the motivations of the characters didn't make sense. It's sort of like, here's a thing that I've discussed before in my videos, is that you can have a character do whatever they want, but the audience will judge you if they don't like what the character does. They will decide whether they like or dislike a character based on their actions. So when you have a character make a stance of some kind, it should be in line with what the general consensus about what's right and wrong is. I don't mean politically, I'm talking about in general. If a character does something that goes against what people consider good values or good behavior, then you're risking alienating a bunch of people. So going back to Tarantino for a second, Tarantino often has characters do things that are generally considered not to be good things, like doing copious amounts of drugs and everything, certain kinds of bad behavior. He does it for sort of shock or entertainment value. Some people like that and some people don't. But as far as having characters step out of line, so to speak, and make a decision that many people might not agree with, you risk alienating people, because there's a general moral code that people have, no matter what the culture. There's a general sense of right and wrong that's embedded in the DNA of human beings. And when the character does not go along with that, then you risk alienating people. And so a lot of people in Hollywood, to put it mildly, a lot of them don't have a moral code that a lot of people agree with, you know?
Mm.
So, yet they tend to lecture us about right and wrong a lot, but a lot of them don't really seem to understand what right and wrong is at all, or have a sense of what's good and bad. So, that's why a lot of them tend to be out of step with the audience. And that's why a lot of stuff today, especially, seems to be out of step with what the average person really agrees with. And that's why a lot of things do really well financially, but they don't have the kind of life that they could have.
Well, I don't imagine Avatar really didn't have any staying power in my mind.
No, and he has 4 sequels that he's supposedly already wrapped on. He shot like all of them over a couple years, and now he's in post, which is going to take another couple years. But I mean, like, does anyone care, and will anybody show up? I mean, he knows how to tell a story. Definitely, he's very good at that, and visually it was fantastic. But I really didn't like. First of all, I recognized all of the sources for the ideas, and that so he had like Roger Dean, album cover conceptual painter, was obviously the influence there. He even sued Cameron for stealing the look of his paintings,
and somehow lost.
Because, but you could tell where the influence came from. Oh. And then there was a writer named Alan Dean Foster who wrote a series of books that were sort of like a ripoff of Tarzan, but it was set on an alien rainforest planet where the rainforest trees are like miles tall, and there was a zone somewhere in the middle or towards the top where, like, Earth-like conditions, where there's this Tarzan-like character who's basically grew up being raised by these alien apes. So it's basically Tarzan apes, but it's on an alien planet.
Kind of Stranger in a Strange Land.
Yeah, I forget the name of the series, but I read them all when I was a teenager. Anyways, it's exactly the same story as this. The same kind of thing where somebody went native and has lived with these aliens, and it has the structure is very similar, where the look and everything of this world is very similar to the way Alan Dean Foster describes, even though his is like a giant rainforest, and it wasn't quite a rainforest necessarily in Avatar. With the levels, because in that world, the further down you got, the more hostile it is, and it just had bigger monsters and everything towards the bottom, and then towards the top it was a little bit more safe to live. But other than that, it's pretty much like, so much of it is just reminding me of that books. I was just like, man, he obviously read these books, and he's just kind of riffing on that. So I mean, like, you have to really make things your own. You can't just take ideas and think nobody's going to remember them like 30 years later, because I did. I remembered it, and I'm sure a lot of other people who read those books did.
Well, there's a video, it's about half an hour long. It's called Everything's a Remix, and it kind of shows the difference between just straight out stealing from something or taking a combination of influences where you can feel the influence, but you can also feel the artist's personal stamp on it. Again, visually, I think the big mistake James Cameron made with Avatar is usually you can take frames from a movie as they progress, and you can see general color changes throughout time. Like, definitely through the original Star Wars movies, you can see, like Tatooine is sand and blue, and the space station is grays, and then you go to the forest planet, and
right.
Then the same with Empire Strikes Back. You've got the white frost planet, and then you've got kind of the brown and black space, and the swamp is gray, and then Cloud City is like always in perpetual sunset. Avatar is only ever green. It's just green and blue, like the whole way through this. Visually, it gets boring, even though they've got amazing graphics and everything down to the littlest detail, and they spent years on it. It's still, detail wise, it's excellent, but big picture, it's like hanging.
Yeah, but going back to what I was saying earlier about having characters do things that the audience doesn't agree with morally, the problem with Avatar is the whole premise is that this guy goes native and decides to betray his entire planet all for this one chick he falls in love with. And basically, he's willing to see his own people die off, even though his own people are doing reprehensible things, arguably, and they're doing it for survival reasons of their own. But the characters are ridiculous. Like the bad guys are such cartoons. But the thing is that it's kind of it raises a moral argument that a lot of people would not agree with, which is you should betray everybody that you know and your family and everything. If you fall in love with somebody, you can just betray everyone else. That's not a very good message that a lot of people agree with.
Well, the thing that really bothers me about Avatar, where he tries to make it okay, is like you said, he makes the bad guys so cartoonishly bad and selfish,
right?
To a degree that it's so one-dimensional. You're like, well, how could you argue these people are so bad? It's like, yeah, because you wrote them that bad just so you could justify.
That's the thing. People respond to believable nuance. They want things. They don't care if something is unrealistic in terms of the setting or whatever, but it has to be realistic on some level. So the characters, the protagonist and the antagonist, they have to show depth of some kind, so that we can believe them as characters and they're not just cartoons. And if you don't imbue some humanity in their villains, then they just come off like cookie cutter characters with wax mustaches. They're not people.
Well, this is why I think the big argument with Marvel villains is that they're so one-dimensional, but then there's that one Marvel villain. I think they're getting better at their villains, but the one Marvel villain that everyone actually loves, they keep bringing him back, is Tom Hiddleston as Loki. Because you understand where Loki is coming from. You don't agree with it, but he's charming, he's funny, he's angsty, he's angry that he became bad because he learned that his whole life was a lie. People that he trusted were lying to him, and he makes bad choices because of that. But Loki has been in the Marvel universe since the first Thor, and they chose him for the Avengers, and then they brought him back in Thor, and when they killed him off in Thor, and then they brought him back, and then they thought he killed him off again, and then he came back again. They kept finding reasons to bring him back because he was...
Now he's just got his own TV station channel on the new Marvel series. TV channel they're planning. They've got a Loki show on it.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. You see, and he's the bad guy, arguably there are different bad guys that I think they are getting better at it.
Like Thanos is a bad guy, but
Infinity War is all about Thanos. That's his movie.
Yeah, but I mean he's bad, but he has this philosophy behind his ideas, and he does care about his people on his side, and he including his daughter Gamora, and so he has like humanity, even though he's a totally inhuman, psychotic person. You can see dimensions to him, even though he's a cartoon character. Visually, he's like a CGI thing. But, they make him like human by giving him human qualities. If you don't have that, if you don't imbue characters with human qualities, they're not human and they're just statues. They're just objects to be knocked over. They're not people. And that's the thing. A lot of writers fail to comprehend, not just comic book writers. Comic book writers are really bad at this, but I see this a lot in film and television. But the idea that, I'll just say that in my business, in the comic business, especially back in the 80s, there was a lot of people saying they were tired of superheroes, and they were like, this series that I'm doing right now is the book that will end superheroes, that nobody will ever want to do superheroes after this comes out, and like 3 or 4 people came up with this ridiculous claim. The thing is, a superhero is just a character, and a character, it should be a person. It doesn't matter what a character is, if they're a cowboy or a vampire or whatever. If they don't have human qualities, if they don't have dimension to them, then they aren't real. They're obviously not real because they're a character in a fiction, but a character that lives and breathes for hundreds of years, thousands of years or whatever, that people still care about. Like the characters from the Greek myths. They are the reason Greek myths are so popular and effective thousands of years after they were conceived is because the Greek gods and all those characters have deep human qualities. Despite all their irrational, strange behavior, they have very relatable and understandable motivations people can relate to. That's what separates them from almost every other, mythology you can name, is that the Greek gods were the most human in their conception, and that's what fiction needs to have, is a humanity to it that is lacking from a lot of material you see it today. There's too much formula. There's too much, you have to do this by this page and you have to do that by this page and all this type script writing. They don't understand that the character motivation is a primary force in a story, and that's what people relate to, and that's what people latch on to, and that's where people care about what happens. And if the characters do not inspire confidence in the audience, then the audience will not care what happens to them and will not remember them when they leave the theater or shut the book or whatever.
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind too is, the beats that people think they have to hit are not a result of a good writer saying, I've got to hit this beat. They are the result of good characterization. Good, like a character will naturally hit that beat if you're giving them good motivation and giving them good, human qualities. What is it? This one YouTuber that complains that comic book writers don't know how to human, is using it as a verb. But I was going to say, going back to Tarantino, there is one story he told that I thought was quite memorable, which was Bruce Willis as the boxer.
Mm-hmm.
And
I don't know if that was his or he had a partner on that movie.
Oh, did he? Okay. Well, what I liked about that story was it opened with the Christopher Walken with the watch story.
Yeah.
But it was like, you realize Bruce Willis's life as an adult is paralleling the story that was told to him about the watch. And you realize that Bruce Willis's motivations throughout that movie are all influenced by the values that were instilled in him through that speech. The fact that he has, his father was a prisoner of war, and then he ends up having the Vietnamese girlfriend. And, and then when he gets captured and he has the chance to run, it's a samurai sword that he chooses, an Asian artifact, and he's gonna run. He's out, and with Marcellus Wallace would kill him, would do the same to him. He stops and he turns around to go back to get him because he knows that the platoon that his father was in, that's what they would do. Everything he does is motivated by the values that were instilled in him by his father's legacy.
Again, you have characters with a motivation and a philosophy that drives their actions. That's what makes him a human being, because humans don't always take the predictable path. A lot of times people will do things, you're like, why did they do that? And then you realize this is what drove them. This is the force that motivates their actions. If you have characters doing things without that motivating force, without that philosophy, without that sense of what drives them, such as Rey in Star Wars, where we don't have any idea about her or her background or anything, other than she was living selling scrap parts. Other than that, we don't know anything about her. I mean, this is the thing. This is what makes one character a cipher and one character a fleshed out, interesting character.
Well, and I think too, understanding the beginning, what kind of story do I want to tell? I always kind of approached it in the terms of, if I was at a campfire and I was telling a bunch of kids that I was camping with, like, what if I had something very adult in my life happen that I would not be appropriate to tell these kids, but I had to tell them it in a way that I imparted the lesson I learned from it, and and not leave out any important details of what made me evolve to that lesson. Okay, that's the theme. So how do I tell that theme in a way I'm forced to be disciplined in not using, crude sexual situations or things that are too violent or bad words because I'm talking to kids. And kids, I'm talking about metaphorically. But I have to discipline myself into making sure that that lesson and that theme and those morals all get across in my story in an entertaining way. So then I make up a story about, I change, like there was this like crazy girl that I was trying to get together with to, I really wanted this candy bar that was sold out and I had to, I mean, I'm just pulling stuff out of the air, but you have to discipline yourself to, it's almost like you're trying to impart the theme and the goals and the lesson all have to come ahead, and then you have to craft the story around that in a way that's believable and entertaining. And I don't know if I explained that quite as well, but do you get kind of what I'm going after there? I mean, I always try and say, okay, this is a story about one story which I won't talk about while recording because it's too early in the game, but one story is all about family and the importance of family and the importance specifically of motherhood. But it's a science fiction story, and so it's how do you take a science fiction story and you're promising the audience science fiction, aliens, robots, outer space travel.
Those are all abstract things, though. You need the human. This is what the comic in science fiction. When I was growing up, especially, they were told it was just junk, and our teachers in school told us it was junk. And it was like I remember a teacher when I was in junior high said that I never got into science fiction because it's about stories about people with parking meters as heads. And I'm like, what? What the hell is it? But I mean, it's just because that's how he saw it, because there was no humanity there for him. He didn't see the humanity in the stories. A good science fiction writer had humanity in the stories, and he didn't read those stories, obviously. But the point is that a lot of times people think that effects is somehow superior to depth. That's not true at all. Surface is never superior than depth. But surface is what the first thing people see. But just because it's the first thing people see doesn't mean that that's where they're going to get the meat of it all. The meat of it all comes from the depths.
They may show up from the trailer that showed the cool explosion, but most of us can create a cool explosion in After Effects on our home computer now. They may be impressed by the trailer, but how many times do people say, "Oh, the trailer looked exciting, but the movie was boring"? It's because all that surface stuff. Anybody can promise that to give them, like I love Aliens because Aliens is an interesting story to me about a survivor who has to go back and confront this thing one more time. But what really makes the story interesting is when she meets Newt, who's another survivor, and it's like they bond over having both survived the same thing, and then from there you have all these other characters around them that are relating to them in different ways, have different assumptions, have their own arcs, their preconceived ideas versus what they have to go through. There are redemption stories in secondary characters that they kind of fly under the radar because you're busy paying attention to Sigourney Weaver's character and Newt, but there's the whole thing about Gorman and Vasquez, how Vasquez resents Gorman because Gorman is only like his second drop and he screwed it up royally and got her partner killed. So there's a big tension between, they didn't like each other to begin with, but they're the ones that Gorman ends up going back and dying with Vasquez, where he redeems himself in her eyes. I think James Cameron was incredibly successful with that story where
his movies were good until he started getting political, and by political, I mean just like generic Hollywood trope political. Just arguments that are like just cliched. I mean, like Terminator 2, for example, was a very great movie in many respects, but the argument nuclear war is bad, that's...
It's
duh.
Too easy. It's too easy.
It's ridiculous. It's like a ridiculous... It's just, you could do better, obviously. You're a guy with his talent could do a lot better than what he did. It's just like his He just unhooked his thinking trailer from his brain and just let it go down the tracks because he didn't feel he needed it anymore. You do need it. You need to have that weight to give some balance to it all. Without that, you don't have anything. It's just. But yeah, like we both like David Lynch. A lot of people don't like David Lynch, but what I like about David Lynch is that he does so much with so little. That like in Lost Highway, in the I remember when I first saw the trailer for that movie. There's a scene with Bobby Blake talking to Bill Paxton. And
Bill Pullman.
Bill Pullman, right? Sorry. And Bobby Blake shows up at this party, and he's got this heavy eyeshadow, and it's kind of weird. And he says,
"I'm at your house."
Yeah, I'm at your house. I'm at there right now. And he goes, "What do you mean?" I'm at your house right now. And he goes, "That's crazy." And so he says, "Pick up the phone and call me." So he calls his house, and he answers. Bobby Blake answers, and he says, "I told you." Now, that's an impossible thing, but it's also super creepy and weird, and you're like, what? How did that happen? And that's intriguing and interesting, and it's all with acting. There's no special effects, there's no explosions, there's no CGI. It's just two people talking in a room, and that is good writing to me, is where you can inspire people, you can really affect people emotionally on some level with just two people talking. To me, that's the thing. If you can do that, that is really talent. It's not with just having like a bunch of CGI, because that just takes a budget, and a budget and a bunch of people good at CGI.
Yeah, no, talented actors I'm learning as a filmmaker, are invaluable. And I really enjoyed the third season of Twin Peaks, but it had a flaw that I really have a lot of trouble with, and that is, again, without getting political, Mark Frost, the co-creator and co-writer with David Lynch on Twin Peaks, is heavy into Twitter, very opinionated on Twitter, which he's entitled to be. But there are scenes in the third season of Twin Peaks where I see it's Mark Frost writing, because the characters talk as if he hasn't quite unhooked himself from Twitter. He's kind of got, I've heard people refer to it as Twitter disease, where they go on a Twitter tirade over something, and then it seeps into the scripts for Twin Peaks. And I thought that's where the series was at its weakest. When I knew David Lynch was in charge of whatever, with the writing or whatever, I could tell, because Lynch, as he says, it's like, let me see if I can do my best David Lynch impersonation here. You spend a lot of time trying to put it into visuals, and once you're done, then everybody wants you to put it into words again. That's my David Lynch. I can do it better sometimes. I had, with a
I got it. Yeah, my feeling is that with that show, tons of brilliant ideas, and he did answer a lot of questions left unanswered by the TV series, but then he left it with a cliffhanger and raised a lot more questions at the end. Instead of, he spent that whole third season, I kept waiting for Agent Cooper to come back to reality, but when he does, it was just for a very short amount of time, and ultimately nothing happened other than to set up another story, which he said would take years to do if he ever did it at all. David Lynch, I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And that's just disappointing. I don't think he should have done that. He should have given people a little bit more for that, but there were so many original and unique ideas in there and executions, and again, without a lot of CGI. A lot of it was just very simple effects, optical effects that were not complicated, but they were just disturbing anyways.
There was, my favorite episode, though, I gotta say, is it was actually a pretty special effects heavy episode, but a lot of it was old school effects. It was the episode Got a Light, which was just, it was kind of like a high budget student film or art house film, but it was kind of also, after David Lynch said like the midnight movie, the midnight theaters were dead, he kind of did a midnight theater movie. Like, he managed to sneak it in there. Which
yeah, the whole thing had a sort of that kind of feel to it, that whole series. Because he likes those old school effects that he learned in college.
I do too. I'm building right now. I'll show it to you after we're done with this. I'm building a forced perspective gag, no green screen, all for Bill Oberst Jr.'s Ray Bradbury play. And the more I've worked on it, the more excited I've gotten about it, because it is. There will be some digital effects added in post, but things like butterflies flying around and that sort of thing. But the miniature that I built, the forced perspective, it was like at a certain point I went, I don't need to do green screen in this at all. And it just, the joy of doing that, and I know it's going to work out a lot better for that. It's going to be a lot more interesting, because everything these days kind of has that visual effect. I call it like a wind tunnel or a sand tumbler, where it takes interesting things and it just polishes them all down into the same round shape.
Yeah, it's boring. When I was a kid, I grew up on all the old school practical effects, because that's all there was. But I dreamed of a day when they could make that stuff more realistic looking. But now that I'm at that point, I'm sort of like, yeah, it's not more realistic, really. It's just polished, but it's not realistic.
Yeah, it's
like you can still tell it's not real. I mean, they can do things that you couldn't do in practical effects, like water, cascading water, like floods and stuff. You could always tell it was like a miniature set and everything, and miniatures getting knocked over.
Although we've gotten better at that too. We've gotten
Yeah.
better at, and computers have enhanced the practical effects. But yeah, sometimes I feel like you're right, it doesn't look more realistic. There are times too I watch older CGI movies where it's more apparent that it's CGI, and I actually enjoy it more than the most recent CGI, that they are very good at rendering it almost, lighting it, everything lifelike, but it also takes kind of the uniqueness out of it.
Well, it's like watching 16K video games versus the current K video games. There's something about those early 16-bit video games, like Donkey Kong or whatever. They're very crude, but somehow they're more fun in their own way than some modern games are.
Exactly. And, with CGI, in terms of, like I said, again, the Star Wars prequels, especially one of the things that stands out in my mind is about the Star Wars prequels. They weren't the most realistic of CGI, but they were colorful. They combined them with miniatures, and they were using practical makeups. Like the whole thing about, it's entirely CGI was just marketing, because CGI was the buzzword. But, now I'm seeing, again, the new Disney Star Wars movies. Was it, like Rogue One and Solo? It's like they're very well done CGI, but it just looks like everything else. Kind of it's the trend to desaturate everything.
Yeah, the color stuff gets me a lot.
I really enjoyed, and I know this is I know this is kind of a polarizing one. I really enjoyed Thor Ragnarok.
I do. I liked it.
You liked it too? Okay, good. Because people was like, it ruined everything. I was like, they're going like, okay, they're comic book movies. We shouldn't be afraid to have fun with them. But I loved how they went for the Kirby-esque outfits and sets.
It was very Kirby. It was more faithful to Kirby than most of those movies are. And I don't like them killing off the Asgardians or stuff like that. But at the same time, at least it was all for the purpose of something. I mean, the whole subject is Ragnarok, so it's the end of Asgard. That's a whole mythology thing into itself, so it's not like that's out of the blue. And they did, even though they messed with the Marvel continuity, it is kind of sort of part of the mythology of Ragnarok. So, I don't know, I don't have a problem. I didn't. The other Thor movies to me were just boring, and they didn't really capture the flavor of Thor for me.
They were just kind of bleh.
This one captured, even though Kirby's Thor wasn't quite like that, it wasn't as comical and everything, but it did have that rollicking kind of adventure feel.
Yeah.
That those Kirby comics did, and in the Kirby Thors, he traveled all over the galaxy and went to all these planets and did all this stuff, which is kind of like what this movie did. And so that to me is fine. I had no problem with that. What I don't like is when they The Marvel movies, that's a whole subject unto itself. But I just feel like really, to me, I'm more interested in original ideas, original stuff. I always have been, and
Well, ultimately, this is why I do this show too. Is it's fun to talk about and analyze all these popular things, but I keep driving home again and again. You don't try and be those things because you're not. And but even if you could accomplish it, by the time you do, they would have moved on to something else.
well, the thing is that everything is a copy of something, but taken to another level. So eventually, somebody gets it right. So a lot of times, somebody originates an idea, but it's somebody else who makes it successful. So you might come up with something, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be the recipient of the reward. Although you might be credited someday as the guy who really came up with the idea, but ultimately you shouldn't worry about those things. You should just try to make something good unto itself, not try to be the freshest, most original thing, because a lot of times originality goes right over people's heads. They don't see it. And I can tell you that from experience, so you just have to do your thing and hope for the best, and try not to look too much like you're imitating anyone else.
Well, I think that's actually a great way to wrap up the episode. So, James, thanks for having me over, and it's a pleasure to do an interview face to face. So I really appreciate it. And I'll link it in the description, but just in case I space out and forget to, where can people find you on the web? You've got a website and you have a YouTube handle.
Yeah, on my website is jameshudnall.com, HUDNALL, or thehud.com will get you there also, THEHUD.com. On YouTube, I'm James Hudnall. You can find me that way. And my campaign agenda is still going. Even though we reached our goal, it's going to be going on to the end of February. And so I would really appreciate anyone checking that out and donating if you feel compelled to. I also have a Twitter account, James D. Hudnall. And I'm only use that to promote the latest videos and comics and stuff like that on there. I'm not a big Twitter personality as far as arguing about stuff, but I do say check my YouTube channel because that's where I'll be doing most stuff. And I also have a Facebook channel, Facebook page, which is James Hudnall, James.Hudnall. So that's my web presence for now.
Well, I think you're doing a great job with the YouTube channel, so that's going to be my recommendation for people. And I'll link the Indiegogo and all the pertinent links in the description. But the YouTube channel's got some very valuable writing information. I highly recommend that. Like the videos, subscribe, hit the notification bell, pin it to your Pinterest board. They still have that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a Pinterest page also, Hudnall Comics.
I do actually use Pinterest. I find it very handy for pinning up tutorials and stuff. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, James, again. No post-show this time. Usually there is, but it's getting dark here, so we've got to wrap it up. But please come back for another episode. Thanks again, James, and you guys keep creating.